Blessings to you on this 37th day of Lent. And today's suggested recentering is to take 3 deep breaths. So if you will join me, hold it and release. One more if you'll join me. I was listening to baseball season is here, and I was listening to an interview with a second-year pitcher for the Seattle Mariners, George Kirby, and he was mentioning that the biggest difference between last year and this year in terms of his preparation was learning to control his breath. So if professional athletes that are making, well, he'll eventually make millions of dollars, um, but are at the top of their game and starting in the starting rotation for a major league ball club are focusing on their breath, well, we can too, in order to center ourselves and get the most out of our time with God. So today, our message is called Overlooked, and we will be reading from 1 Samuel 16, verses 6 through 13. I'll be reading from the New International Version. My guess is that for many of you, this will be a story that is familiar, at least in part. Well, when they arrived, meaning Jesse's son, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed stands here before him." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." Then Jesse called Abinadab and had him pass in front of Samuel. But Samuel said, "The Lord has not chosen this one either." Jesse then had Shammah pass by, but Samuel said, "Nor has the Lord chosen this one." Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, but Samuel said to him, "The Lord has not chosen these." So he asked Jesse, "Are these all the sons that you have?" "Well, there is still the youngest," Jesse answered. "He is tending the sheep." Samuel said, "Send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives." So he sent for him and had him brought in. He was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features. Then the Lord said, "Rise and anoint him. This is the one." So Samuel took out the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. Samuel then went to Ramah. Before I get into the reflection that I wrote in the book, it struck me that the pretext for this meeting between Samuel and Jesse and his boys was a sacrifice, a time of worship together, and then to have a feast, basically to sit down and dine together. And everybody's invited except for David, who's out tending the sheep. And I find that remarkable. Sometimes we think of David as this huge hero that was always a part of God's plan, and people recognize that. And here we have at the very start of, at his anointing, the start of his journey with God and becoming the man that's later described as a man after God's own heart, and the king of Israel, and somebody who would establish a throne that the eventual Messiah would come from, sitting on the throne of David. And he's overlooked. He's forgotten. He's not even invited to the party. And so for all of us that have felt overlooked or passed over or forgotten at times, that is a remarkable affirmation, or should be, that God sees us and God calls us. So now for what I've written in the book. I hope that little aside was okay and maybe spoke to somebody that's listening to this or viewing this now. Well, despite the instruction that Samuel has from God to disregard the outward appearance of the sons of Jesse, he easily defaults to the cultural expectations and the prejudices of his day. So when Jesse's older boys come before him, he's impressed. He's like, okay, surely this is the the next king of Israel. This is the one that I was sent for. Eliab is the first son to pass in front of him, and God speaks to Samuel in that moment and says, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things that people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Well, Samuel was going to have to rely on his ability to hear God's voice and trust God's direction. He couldn't merely trust what his eyes saw and what his experience told him would make a great leader. So 7 sons pass in front of Samuel, each time getting the big nope from God. And the youngest son then, not even originally called to meet the prophet and be a part of this party, is sent for it. David's been overlooked by his father, but not by God. And the amazing thing about God and God's kingdom is that those things which the world esteems mean very little in his economy. God enjoys using those of us that are not outwardly very impressive, are often overlooked, and God uses us to accomplish his purposes. I believe that part of the wisdom of God's using people like you and I is that it's clear that what we accomplish is not our own doing. It is only by the grace of God. Not all of us are destined to do great things like David. In fact, very few of us are, but we each have a purpose and a value to God. God's love has called us, and his voice gives us confidence to step forward and do what God asks. The results will be that God is glorified, not those of us he uses to accomplish his purposes. A further insight, if you'll indulge me. Often the difficulties that we've gone through and the deficits that we have because we've had to endure, those things are redeemed by God in miraculous ways. The most empathetic, insightful, and kind people that I have met are those that have survived traumatic experience and have come through that with grace and wisdom. God takes their hurt and brings healing, sometimes only making that healing complete as they reach out to others who are suffering. The gentle way that they approach others in difficult circumstances shows God's mercy in the midst of suffering. So don't overlook how God might use your past to gain insight into the present and give others hope for the future. Remember today, and I hope always, that being underestimated by people doesn't mean you are overlooked by God. Other passages for contemplation today would be Psalm 31, verses 9 through 16, and Philippians chapter 1, verses 1 through 11. God bless you. Hope to see you tomorrow.